Hey.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Conversations for Change, Mastering the Art of Conversation with Keita Demming. And Anya, this is a conversation I'm really pumped for. I'm
Well,
really
it's going to be a
excited.
conversation about the conversations.
I
So it's,
know.
mhm,
We're going meta.
we are this time for real. I mean, we always go meta, but this time we're actually going to be diving into the details of just how we are conversing. This is going to be really, really interesting. What are your expectations, Margaret?
Well, we're thinking about the way we converse, right? Um, no, I've had a little bit of exposure to some of the work that Keita is doing now, and it is really tremendous and cutting edge in terms of how they're integrating neuroscience into their frameworks for helping people build better conversations. So, from the time I began to understand what he was doing a little bit, right? I was like, this is definitely something that we have to engage with our community and all of that. So I am,
Having a conversation.
yes, I'm trying to navigate a conversation here while trying to navigate a conversation with viewers. Right? Very difficult. Um, so we have Keita today, who is really well known in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean and North America, particularly for his work in organizational behavioral research, and also because he has spearheaded one of the most successful TEDx events worldwide, TEDx Port of Spain, and he's been running that for many, many years. He's also the founder of Disruptive Conversations, that podcast,
Hmm.
which he uses to have conversations with some of the most innovative thinkers, people who are disrupting their industries, change makers. And you can really see if you check out his podcast, he spent many years becoming an expert in conversations himself, and has a lot of experience doing these things. So, expectations, just to connect with Keita again, who, I mean, he always has these, you know, droplets of wisdom to drop on us. Try to understand a little bit more about, his motivation for the work that he's doing, and also to share a little bit about the masterclass that he's going to have next week that we're very excited for, a 3-hour deep dive, so
Mm.
that if you come out of conversations thinking, oh my god, I why did I say that, or could I have said this better, or oh my god, did I hurt this person's feelings?
Mm.
How can we, I guess, create a framework that we could use and practice, so that maybe after conversations we may not have those kinds of regretful moments. So those would be like my expectations. And then what about you?
I'm just thinking, like, one thing is the rhetorics, right? Just what words we use and how do we approach to a person, and how to navigate the emotions, and then all the little things. But I'm actually observing that while we are having conversation in real life, it's more or less about the behavior. And when we are actually driving into the Zoom and StreamYard and all these virtual conferences, it's a bit of a different and difficult conversation to navigate, because you're actually having a person in front of you and it's a digital one. You don't really have to be so cautious or aware of the behavior. Maybe, just how we position our heads, and then how we nod with our heads and stuff like that. But it's a bit of a different thing, to really be careful about just how people are approaching the conversation. And I'm really interested in that.
And
Um, mhm.
and for you, yeah, we'll bring Keita in now. But for you, I think, because you speak different languages and English isn't your first language, and most of the conversations you have professionally, through Future Law and some of the other work you're doing with clients all over the world, um, would be in English. And
Mm.
I know you navigate a lot because of that. So it'd be interesting to see maybe if Keita has any um, ideas or
Oh, I truly hope
structure.
so. You
Structure.
know me, every time it's like the end of the day, my English just goes down, 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 and I lost all the words. It's really hard to actually do that. But yeah, I hope he's going to have some encouragement here, or yeah, any
Yeah.
advice. Let's
Okay.
bring him in.
Okay. So let's bring Keita in. Hello, Keita. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing? Can you all hear me?
Yes, loud and
Yes, we
clear.
can
Awesome.
hear you, and
Awesome.
you're as laid back as ever. Now, Keita, I mean, welcome to the show. We're really excited to have you here. I know quite a bit about you, but maybe we could kick this off by you telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came, your trajectory, how you came to now be thinking about how we build conversations better.
It's a bit of a convoluted entry into conversations, but many years ago, I did a master's in organizational change and development, and that's the crux of my work. How to use coaching in organizations to build performing organizations and organizations where people love to work. Um, if you look at the history of organizations, we tend to frame them as organizations as machines. And very early in my career, I came across this notion that organizations were not machines and they were, in fact, conversations. So ever since that, I've been obsessed with trying to figure out how do we have better conversations, primarily as a tool for creating better organizations. So that's where my journey started. It started now a long time ago. I don't want to age myself, but it's been more than a decade of me being really fascinated about conversations. And you mentioned TEDx Spain. The first year we did TEDx Spain, the theme was changing conversations. And the whole idea was if we change the conversation, we change the trajectory of the island. So everything I've ever done has had this theme of how do we have better conversations or change conversations. That makes sense?
All right. Yeah, makes sense. And tell me something, Keita. Your demeanor has always been this sort of laid back, calm. I always mention it when we connect, this calming energy, this slow, moderate tone in your delivery. Would you say that aids you in conversations? That is one, is it inherent? Have you always been like that, or is this something practiced? And do you think that kind of demeanor really helps you uh, in conversations?
So a couple of things. Number one, if you've ever met my dad is very similar in tone and
True.
demeanor. And I think actually you know my dad very well.
Yeah.
So I
He's my
might be I
friend.
get it from him. I might get it from him as well. But there's a story that I often tell where I played a lot of soccer and I played soccer at a high level. And I remember one time this I was defending and this guy beat me and it was because I panicked. And he panicked and he almost scored. And I remember from that day on, I'm like, you have to control that panic button. So what I started to do from that moving on in soccer is I always focus on the ball and never on the person. So what is the objective we're trying to do? What I'm trying to do is make sure that ball doesn't go in the net. So no matter what he does, I'm focusing on that ball. And the goal was to never panic. I think that moment was something that became a practice for me moving forward, which is most people are paying attention to all of the distractions and
Mm-hmm.
not the ball or the goal that you're going after. And it's the same
Mm-hmm.
thing in conversations. So in a conversation, if you find yourself in an argument with somebody or disagreement, asking yourself, okay, what is the goal of this conversation? That alone, just asking that disruptive question in your own mind could change the trajectory of that conversation because you're no longer trying to win. What you're trying to do is now meet some kind of goal or objective. And then that automatically begins to get you to think about what if I say next? Is this going to help me get my goal? And that alone is just that intentionality that you bring to a conversation. I think I don't know if that answers your question about my calm demeanor, but what
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
what I'm always trying to do is trying to say, okay, are we doing the work we want to do? Are we accomplishing what we came here to do today? And I think I've that story of the soccer is something I've always tried to pay attention to. Like, am I paying attention to the ball or am I paying attention to the player? I think it's a big distinction.
I hear you on this. And you know, you want to because I want to go a little bit with this, because I mean, there's a little tension I feel with this sometimes, right? I can see the power in what is the objective of the conversation and keeping your eye on that ball. But sometimes, could you see that that can come in conflict with deepening authentic connection with the person that you're having a conversation with? Can you see perhaps that there can be a conflict there? Because
So tell me more about what you mean there.
Because I feel like I think I find myself in this situation a lot where I understand the objective of the conversation. I understand how I should respond. To keep things in a particular way. But then I said, but then I would not be being authentic to who I am in this moment. And I would not be allowing the other person to have an authentic interaction with me. And so I have to navigate that quite a bit. And I mean, when you're talking about difficult conversations as well, you know, where it's about relationships, and it's about, you know, yeah, honesty and showing up authentically. I think there's sometimes there's a tension there. You wouldn't say so?
So no, so I think the word authentic is really problematic for me, but we can have that conversation another time.
Okay.
But the
No,
goal
I'm
is
happy to have the conversation. No, when I say
no.
authentic, let's
But
say,
hold, let me flip that. I'm going to come at it from a different angle. But the goal is to understand the other person's perspective. The goal is not to be right. It's not to prove them wrong. The goal is to begin to understand what are they saying. So somebody has some belief that you disagree with.
but
Your
isn't that
first goal
okay?
Your first goal is to understand how they've come to that conclusion. There's nothing inauthentic by understanding what that person's perspective is. And because you understand their perspective, it doesn't mean you agree with it. And I think people conflate those two things often. Me seeking to understand that other person's point of view deeply doesn't mean I have to agree with it. But you first have to begin to get that point to understanding. Second thing is,
Okay.
we often try to change people's mind. You can't change
Yeah.
anybody's mind. You can't. So all you can do is, what I often say is, you can plant seeds of doubt. That's about as far as you can go. The other person has to change their own mind. You can't change their mind. So the goal in that conversation is, how do I plant a seed of doubt so that that person changes their mind for themselves? You can't do that work. So there's a reason I call this project Better Conversations Project. The goal is to make the conversation better. And there are things that we do because of our life history, because of our experience, etc., that may not make the conversation better, which is why I focus on goals. What is the goal of that conversation? If the goal is for you to be right and to prove your point, that where that conversation is going to head may not get you what you want, right? You have to decide, what is the goal of this conversation. I enter every conversation to saying, I'm going to have a conversation partner today. So I'm in partnership with you. In that partnership means that I'm going to lead and follow sometimes. Right now I'm leading. So you put a prompt out there for me, which was around authenticity, etc. And I followed you there and said, tell me more about that. Can you dig into that? What do you mean by following? Now I'm leading and saying, I don't want to talk about the authenticity piece, but what I do want to talk about is, like, first seek to understand the other perspective and really be clear that understanding somebody's perspective doesn't mean you agree with it. Those are two very different things. But I think we conflate the two things all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
Does that answer your question, or does that make you feel?
It doesn't fully answer my question, because I don't think that in every single conversation, the goal is only to understand the other, right? I think part of the goal of the conversation is to understand the other, but part of the goal of the conversation is also to be understood, I would think. And so I think there are many situations. Let's think of the issue of race and racially charged conversations. And it was really interesting. I was listening to Red Table Talk. I don't know if you know it. Red Table Talk with Jada Pinkett Smith and all that. Yesterday, they actually, or day before, yesterday or day before, they were talking about the invisible Black woman. And they raised the phrase of racial gaslighting. And the way they described it was, when someone, a person of color, or it could be a Black woman or any person of color, raises an issue or raises the temperature on something because of how they've been treated, or their experience of how they've been treated, the meaning they've placed on how they've been treated, the typical response is, come on, life's too short. Why are you making a mountain out of a molehill? That's not what we meant. This is all in your mind. It's not really happening. And there is a phrase that is racial gaslighting. When the person was probably just responding from a place of authenticity to the hurt that they experienced, the offense that they took, which, yes, is linked to their embodied trauma. But are you saying that there's a responsibility on those who have this embodied trauma, and it may be unconscious? There's a responsibility on them not to offend others, because
I'm not
they
saying
should go
that
into conversation seeking to
that's
understand.
not what I'm. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. So what I'm saying here, in that situation, I have very little control on the other person's perspective. I only have control on my side of the conversation. So, okay, I have embodied trauma. Number one, do I have the energy today to have this conversation with this person? If the answer to that is no, I walk away. I walk away and make that conversation better. I'm not going to engage in a conversation where I don't have the energy. Let's say I do have the energy to have that conversation. My goal is not then to try and convince them or prove my point, etc. My only goal in that conversation is to plant a seed of doubt. You guys are freezing up. Are you still hearing me?
Yeah, I still hear you.
Yeah, so my only goal in that conversation is to now plant a seed of doubt. So, for example, however they respond to you, how did you first come to believe that? Give me a specific. How do you know that your belief is right? That's the kind of conversation that you want to have. But the minute you get into, this is my belief, and I'm trying to convince you of my belief, you've entered into a combative kind of situation. And the other person is really unlikely to change their point of view in that conversation. So the story I like to tell about this is I have a brother who's 13 months apart. We're 13 months apart. We would have massive fights. And we would have fights, and I would notice that 6 months later, he's making the argument I was making in a fight that we had. And I was like, that's what I was saying 6 months ago. And he's like, no, you never said that. That's because people most often double down on their beliefs in the conversation. So to make the conversation better, you have to decide, do I have the energy to do this? If the answer to that is no, you exit. And that's fine. That is, leave the conversation, but make it better. But there are things that we do that take us down into what I would call a not so better conversation. But anyway, there's a couple of things we could talk about with respect to that. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, man. Yeah.
It's interesting because Margaret really pointed it out. Like, if I'm entering a conversation, I'm entering it because I want to understand the party on the other side. And then what Margaret pointed out was that we also enter the conversation because we ourselves want to be understood. But this is almost as if we are forming the expectation towards the other party that they are interested in getting to know us better to actually understand in the first place. So if there is no understanding, or if there is no willingness to actually understand ourselves when we engage into that conversation, would that possibly demand us planting a seed with those people, whether they even want to understand us in the first place or not? Is that where we should start when we feel like that's the thing?
So if the other person doesn't want to understand or has no interest in understanding, you've just avoided a fight because they have no interest in that, and you have no control over that. Like you have zero control on whether or not the other person wants to understand. Margaret, I've been in those conversations. Those are frustrating. Like as a black man in Canada, like I've been in those conversations, but I have to decide, am I going to be able to move the needle on that other person? And that's the first place to start. Because otherwise you're just going to have a conversation with somebody that's not going to work. I'll give a story that is probably one of my favorite stories around what I think is better conversation. So I might be forgetting the guy's name, or I might be getting the guy's names wrong. But his name is Larry Trapp and Michael and Rachel Wisner. So if I'm remembering the story right, Michael Wisner was a rabbi, and he moved into the small town in the US. And Larry Trapp was a KKK kind of person. So he sent emails, like racist things about Jews, etc. If you don't leave, we're going to bomb you. They called the police. The police said, well, Michael Trapp is very dangerous. He has ammunition. He's used to bombing people, etc. What Rachel and Michael Wisner did was they sent him notes like, did you know that because Larry Trapp was disabled, so he had no legs, and he basically lived in poverty. And he would send letters like, did you know that Hitler, you would have been one of the first people that Hitler would have put into the oven? Did you know that we love you? And they sent all these like love notes on a regular basis, to the point where Larry Trapp ended up calling them and saying, stop calling me, you're frustrating me, etc. Now this went on for years. But what the rabbi Michael did was just approach that situation with love and gave them like little love notes. After some time, Trapp ended up calling Larry and just breaking down. I don't want to be like this. I've been like this in my whole life. I don't know how to get out of this, etc. They end up having a friendship. And Larry Trapp ended up spending the last 4 months of his life living in their living room under hospice care as he died, because he was in poverty and sought forgiveness for hating Jews, etc. But what I loved about that story is that the way the rabbi changed his mind was through love notes. It wasn't through a confrontation. It was through planting seeds of doubt. And it's a really, really powerful reminder of how you actually change minds and have better conversations. It's not, once we start from, I want to win, I want to prove my point, I want you to understand what I'm saying. And that is a valid emotional thing that we need. But starting from that place gets very tricky, especially when the person has dug their heels in and the rock is big. And what I mean by the rock is big is that it's something that they believe so strongly that it's going to take a lot of effort to move that rock. The way you move that rock is by chipping away it slowly. Like it's, if it's a small pebble that they believe, you can move that. You can have a direct conversation with that. You can have, but when it's a big rock, you need a different approach to that. It's something I call the Aikido approach.
Right. You don't push the big rock. That's what
you
you're
don't push
saying.
it. Yeah, you don't push it. Because
you go with the flow.
What ends up happening is you end up fighting with that person. You never talk to them again. That's what happens, and that's not helpful. It's not in the realm of what we call better conversations.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
Anya, I cut you off. Did you want to?
No, not at all. I mean, it's interesting how you actually, for the third time, entered into a story. So I'm now wondering whether, having that approach first to enter into a conversation with a willingness to understand another party is one thing, and then walking away might be the second thing if you don't have the energy, and then the third thing might be the storytelling. How important do you think that is in the conversation?
Well, the storytelling piece is layered, multi-layered. So, for example, Margaret, I'm going to pick on you here for this example. But we all have stories that determine how we see the world. So when you ask me the question around wanting to be heard, or like the question that you asked me, that there's a particular story you have in your head that is informing that question. There's a certain set of beliefs and systems that you have that is informing that. So all of us are bringing these stories that we have that inform the way we see the world. So if I want to change your mind or change your behavior, I have to begin to think about, how do I change the stories that you tell yourself that help you come to the conclusions that you come to? So whether it's like, I think we need to close the Mexican borders and the US, I need to change the story around that for you. But often the way to do that is around telling another story that creates cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance means that it's really difficult to hold two conflicting ideas at the same time. But again, it's going back to how big is that rock? Because the bigger the rock, the more likely people are to double down on their existing beliefs if you tell a counter narrative to that. So the only way to do that is for them to start to convince themselves around changing their beliefs. And there's some simple things you can do around that. Ask them very specific questions about how they first come to that belief. Really getting them to realize that there are holes in their argument. But you can't do that work for them. They have to do that work themselves. And how you do that is by asking questions, listening. And number one is listening. So does that answer the question? The storytelling piece is big, but I think there's a piece around it, the stories we tell ourselves, and that informs the kind of questions and comments we ask. Make sense?
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. And when we think about conversations, what do you think about the issue of responsibility for meaning in a conversation?
So,
yeah.
No, you go ahead. So continue. Yeah.
Meaning, like in a conversation, you may be saying something and thinking that it means something, and the recipient of your communication. Guys, I'm getting an echo. Right? The recipient of the conversation may interpret it in a completely different way. So you enter into a conversation like that. What do we put in place to try to understand the meaning that the recipient is going to give to what you're saying? Is there any guidance you can give on that?
Yeah. So again, there's a piece around radically owning your side of the conversation. So you own your side of the conversation. So one of the things that you often see in conversation is you tell somebody, hey, so I'm going to take a slightly different example. So I'm sure both of you have probably been in an argument where you said, you think this. You're only saying that because you believe this. The minute you do that, you're beginning to predict what the other person is thinking. Mm-hmm. The minute you start doing that, chances are you're going to be wrong. Chances are you're projecting what you're actually feeling about that conversation and not helping that conversation move forward. So a big piece of that is owning your side of that conversation. So you say something and that person interprets it in a different way. Instead of saying, hey, doing the blame game where you didn't understand that or you didn't understand what I meant or whatever, it's on you to then reframe that in a way that makes sense for them. That's a really difficult thing. So things like, let's take it to really difficult conversations like racism, etc. There's a big piece where other people need to do the work. You're not responsible for that. But if you make a point about racism and they don't understand what you said, you need to try and figure out, okay, how can I say this in a different way that helps them understand it? Or can I use a different metaphor that helps them understand it? So radically own your side of the conversation. So piece of my work is we teach sales. And most of the times we're working with people who sell insurance. So an insurance person might come back to us and say, that person wasn't smart, they didn't understand what I was saying to them, etc. And the first thing we say to them is, the other person not understanding is on you.
Right. So this is what I was
It's on
This
you.
is what I was
Like
trying to
you,
get, what your philosophy
yeah,
is on this.
yeah. You need to make sure, like in that context of when you're selling a financial instrument, why this particular product is good for you. If the client doesn't understand, it's not the client's fault. You haven't done a good enough job to make that clear and understandable in a simple and compelling way. When it comes to things that are not like sales, etc., and things that are more in the social realm or personal realm, it's a very similar philosophy, but a little bit more difficult because you don't have the same incentive to get as clear in making it a simple and compelling manner, because most times you're having that conversation off the cuff about something you feel like, etc. But owning your side of the relationship, the conversation, is a massive piece around it, and remembering like you can't control that other person, and I think always remembering that there's always the option of walking away from that. The other piece I want to kind of point out is that because of the way we teach or education works, we tend to think of things like in formulaic ways. This is the 5-step process for this. This is the 3-step process to this. This is the formula for getting what you want. Conversations don't work like that. In fact, life doesn't work like that. Life is fluid, dynamic, unpredictable. So a good example of that is when I was learning Spanish and I was learning how to order food, I learned exactly what was in the textbook and I like practiced that, etc. And I went to Cuba. I was in Cuba at the time. And I go to the store and I'm like, okay, I'm ready. I know these skills, etc. And I say, ¿Cómo está? Like I say my first comment. The next comment, they didn't read the book that I read. They said something completely different. Right? So now I don't know what to say because I'm like, you're not supposed to say that. And that kind of thinking doesn't work in conversations. Conversations are like moves, right? It's like dancing. You might give somebody a lead and they don't go in the direction you want them to go. And you then have to adjust to make that conversation smooth, to make that conversation better. That's if the goal is to make that conversation better. Is that helpful?
Wait, but I mean, you made an analogy with dance, right? And with dancing, you also have different styles and you also have different dancers. And how important is it? Because I know that life is very dynamic and fluid and it changes all the time and we can't really predict things. But quite often, and since you mentioned coaching with the conversation, we actually start with archetypes. We try to categorize people into different categories so that we actually know where to start and what to address if a party on the other side is not really understanding what we're saying. Those archetypes usually help us to at least navigate those conversations or at least to define what dancing style we are entering into. Wouldn't you say that that's nevertheless a very important thing to actually make those archetypes or to categorize, or is it not benefiting us?
Yeah, so the answer is both and yes and no. So like if I use the concept of race, there's certain archetypes that work against me and work for me, right? So being a black male, depending on what archetypes you're drawing on, that can work for or against me. So, and I think that goes back to the dynamics of having conversations, is that there are things that are both good and bad in this world, and it's not as simple as I will give you this formula that's going to work in every single context, and you're never going to have a bad conversation ever again. That is impossible. If that's your expectation, I'm not your person. Like this is not what our goal is, and because I have a number of colleagues on this project, our goal is to help people move conversations in a direction that they hope. So, for example, I do TEDx. I've coached a lot of people do TEDx talks. That is a persuasive one-way dialogue or conversation. You are speaking to an audience. The goal there is to convince. So everything I'm saying here is out the window in that particular context because that's not the goal. If I'm going into a sales pitch, my goal is to move people and convince them that this product I'm working on is the way to go. Having said that, I actually don't think that's an effective way to do sales, but we can talk about that in a different context. But what's the goal of the conversation? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to get to? And in some contexts, one approach is more effective than the other. in general, I think in everyday conversation with your friends, your family, with loved ones, in business, in teams, etc., focusing on the other person and radically owning your side of the conversation, and owning that, okay, the person didn't understand it, I need to like change it better. So for example, I since starting this project, I've seen this so many times and I just kind of laugh at myself. Somebody says, hey, I didn't understand that, can you say that again? And they say it again in exactly the same way they said it the first time. And it, like, like you say, sorry, I didn't understand that, and can you repeat that? And the person repeats it, and they repeat it exactly as they said it before. And then they said, hey, do you understand? And people say yes. And most likely they say yes because they don't want to ask you to say it a third time. So just a simple thing like how to make the conversation better is when somebody says, hey, can you say that again, or can you explain that again? You actually take the time to explain it in a different way. Use a different metaphor, use a different analogy, use a different story, and see if that comes across. And it's simple tweaks like that I think go a long way in having better conversations.
Yeah. And looking at the time, we're going to have to close up. But I love what you said there, because it's kind of aligned to some of the work we are doing in YouSolve. That's where we have another hat on, relating to empathy. And one of the things we look at, it's how do you communicate in a way where you recognize that the other person is creating the meaning of what you are saying. You recognize that and you respect it, and that they are coming from their particular way, a view of looking at the world. And many of us look at the world in many different ways. So there are those who look at us, who are convinced and see things, at a gut level, emotionally, instinctively. Oh my gosh, this is what it is. And there are many people that are slower to listen to their gut, and they need facts and figures and stats and that sort of thing. And I think conversations are such a crucial part. Well, it's everything, quite frankly. It's how we communicate with the other, and so that it's so critical, I think, as we're going forward, in terms of how do we transform conflict, because we're in a very divided world right now, very polarized on many different issues. And so I think the work that you're doing.
Sorry, Margaret, sorry for interrupting, for stepping on your words there.
That's okay. I was trying to close up, but yeah.
No, there are a couple of things. There are a couple of things I think are really important to address in what you said. So part of the reason that I decided to like double down on, okay, we need to have better conversations, was because I had this belief that we're living in this increasingly polarized world. Social media is like tearing us apart, etc. So then, as this researcher I dived into the research. What is making us polarized? When you look at the research and you think about a bell curve, most people are in the middle. What's happening in the way social media works is the loudest voices are the polarized voices, which means that we have a perception that the world is polarized, when in fact, we're not as polarized as we believe, which goes into how people add meaning, etc. Which is why when I found out research, I realized, oh my goodness, my whole motivation for deciding to do this project was that I was like you, thinking the world is polarized, etc. I'll send you that. I can send you that research after the call. But I think we need to have better conversations around things like social media, things like this belief that the world is polarized. Because if you look at a lot of the things that we see on social media or news, etc., that we deem unacceptable, it's a very small percentage of people who believe those things, but they're getting a massive platform. They're getting a platform that the world has never seen before. Like, the reach of social media is insane compared to, you couldn't write letters and get the same reach that you
Right.
had.
I hear you. I hear you. I hear you, Keita, on what you're saying. I hear you. But I don't think it's only social media that provides the evidence of the polarization. And so I haven't read the research that you have read. However, I look at the polls. I look at how people are responding to issues in the US and the UK and Europe and Brazil. look at how people are responding to issues on the Israel-Palestine conflict that we're going through right now. Look at how people are responding to the issues relating to Black Lives Matter. And I really can't think that I'm imagining the polarization that is evident at the polls and is evident on these issues.
So I'll send you that stuff. I'll send you that because what I realized, like, you think about it, you think about a bell curve, you think about where people lie on terms of beliefs. It doesn't make sense that it does, but the way we think about the world now is that there's almost like there are two bell curves. There's one bell curve where people believe one thing on the left and one where people believe on the right, and there's this big gap. That is not what's happening.
Well, right.
It's that there's certain voices that are being incredibly amplified. If you think about like a bunch of rights, like you think about women's rights, you think about, despite what's happening with Black Lives Matter, there's a lot of progress being made around Black rights, around civil rights. It seems horrendous, but we are making progress. If you look at where the world is heading, if you look at what the next generation believes, but our perception is very tainted by how the world is unfolding. But that was one of the big passions for why I decided to have this, to double down on, like, how do we have better conversations? And I thought it was about preventing polarization. And I'll give you an example. I'm currently co-writing a book with a friend and colleague on anyway. I don't know, I haven't asked him this, but I'm very sure we land on different political divides in terms of his beliefs and my beliefs. I would call this man one of my closest friends. His values are very aligned with mine. He's a very religious man. He's a very generous, kind person, etc. But he lands on a completely different political spectrum than I do. That has been an amazing learning lesson for me in terms of how do we have conversations with people who we think have beliefs that we think unacceptable. And that's a really, really interesting conversation I think we all need to kind of lean into. Because what's happening is we have this world where families are getting divided because of where they're landing on political issues. Like, people are getting divorces because of it. Like, I know of one family where the wife, it's American family, one is conservative, one is Republican, one is Democratic, and they're married, right? And piece of what's happening there is that could cause massive relationship tensions. And I became motivated to have better conversations because you're seeing more and more of those kinds of things. But then when I looked into the research, it was a bit of a both and scenario where it's about us having better conversations about the 20% of things that we disagree with, whereas the 80% of things we agree on. But that 20% makes all the difference in the world in terms of the things you disagree with. So anyway, that was a long answer to a short question. And
it wasn't an answer, it was an interjection.
Yeah, I did step on your words there because I
go ahead.
No, I did step on your words there, and I apologize there.
No, that's all right. We're having a conversation here, and it's exciting. Things are happening, in this conversation. Anya, do you want to ask Keita anything else before I close up this and encourage people to join us?
I do have one last question.
Go for it.
What is mind-boggling me for quite a long time now is just to which extent we should be abstract when we are speaking or having a conversation, and when we should be very exact. Because I know that with the storytelling and with the metaphors that we use, we tend to open the floor for someone to actually enter and think about it through their own imagination. I'm kind of struggling because I tend to be very exact. I prefer people to be exact with me. So I don't really necessarily like the abstract thinking that much when we want to have, specific steps being made in the future, or where we need to do things, become active and stuff like that. But at the same time, I'm hearing that using metaphors can benefit us a lot, and being abstract, allowing people to actually interpret whatever we are saying, read between the lines, stuff like that, it actually can benefit a conversation. But how do you actually create a balance? Would you have
So I'll
any
say, yeah, my answer today is, because this is a question I'm still wrapping up my head on. I might change my mind in the future, so I'm going to preface with that. I think metaphors and stories are a really powerful way to demonstrate to people what you're thinking and your perspective of the world. Never underestimate the story of one. So I forget the story of that little kid who, his image is in my mind, but when he was washed up on the shore in Syria,
Yes.
that one story told lots of people everything they need to know about what was happening. That was it. You just needed that one story. So there's one story that's extremely powerful. When it comes to trying to change other people's minds, I think, or plant seeds of doubt, I think that's where you get very specific. So you want them to get specific about how they came to their beliefs. And in them getting specific, they begin to realize the gaps in their own beliefs. Your job is not to point out the gaps for them. Your job is to take them down a road where they begin to see that on their own. So get them to get specific on their side. And then you use your own metaphors, analogies on your side. That's my answer today. Might change based on what I'm reading and and coming across and what we're finding. But I also think, like that story I gave you with Michael Weiser and Larry Trapp. That's a story that has always stood out for me. It really convinced me that the way we change people's minds is through kindness and through planting seeds of doubt over a period of time. So one of the things we say in my own work is that buying is a series of micro decisions. So is change. Change is a series of micro changes. People don't change. Like, let's take the Palestine-Israel really. Hypothetically speaking, I'm a radical supporter of Israel. I'm not, but just hypothetically speaking. For me to change my mind on that, there's no conversation yourself or Margaret could have with me today that will make me change my mind tomorrow. How I will likely change my mind is through a series of small insights that then make me realize that I'm wrong. Here's the kicker. I have to come to a place where I have to admit that I'm wrong. And most of us don't have enough pride to do that. There's an emotional piece to this where, how do you come to a place where you admit that you're wrong? There's a guy called Christian Piccicillini. This guy, he was a white supremacist. He founded white supremacist groups, etc. He now works to get white men out of white supremacy groups. He founded a couple of them. And the thing that he talks about is that a lot of the reason why people join those groups is because of lack of belonging.
Yeah.
They don't feel like they have a place in the world. And they latch onto an ideology. Most of us end up having conversations around the ideology and not around the belonging. So instead of me saying to somebody who's a white supremacist, here's why white supremacy is wrong, I should be focusing on how do I help this person feel like they belong in the world, and I'll get further along with that. And that's how you have a better conversation. You don't have a better conversation around the ideology. You have a better conversation around, hey, where do you need community? Why are you so angry? That's where you make the difference. It's not trying to change their beliefs. Or, like, if I was a Christian and you try to convince me that God doesn't exist, that's not going to happen. It's too big of a rock, right? For us to have a different conversation, we have to change the lens in which we're seeing it. So to answer your question, sometimes be specific. I think specific when trying to get people to change their ideas, and be metaphors and general and abstract when you're telling the larger stories.
God, we have to stop. Even though that last story that you shared, about this guy, the white supremacist, and looking at what he really needed, and that was a sense of belonging and not focusing on the ideology. I think that's that is critical. It also reminds me of nonviolent communication methodologies that focus on, get out of the realm of what you all are disputing about or what the issue is, and look at what does the other person really need here. What are they communicating to me that they need? And if they are not communicating it, how can you ask questions around to understand what they need? Then you also need to understand what you need, right? And you create, you from the place of needs, there's a commonality there. Human needs, the human needs analysis approach with nonviolent communication. Mm-hmm.
I would encourage you to. I have a colleague, Jessica Hawkins. I think she's watching today. So she did conflict work for the UN, etc., and her whole work is on conflict. And one of the things I learned, I first came across the idea from my wife, and then I kind of did a deep dive on it with Jessica, where she talks about conflict transformation. So you have to transform the conflict. So most of us end up fighting about an issue, and it usually there's a pattern there. And for us to transform that, we have to think about what are the underlying issues that are causing that conflict. So what we know from therapy is that the presenting problem is very rarely the actual problem. To transform the problem, we have to go back to a couple steps further and figure out what's the power dynamic, what are the things that are leading to that conflict, and we transform that conflict so it reduces and it's not as prevalent. I think what I would like people to take away from this is that I entered into this saying we need to have better conversations because the world is too polarized and we're having too many arguments, etc. And when I read about conversations and I read about conflict, etc., what I noticed is that everybody is focusing on difficult conversations, fierce conversations, crucial conversations, you name it, impossible conversations. That's what all the books are about. My general thesis is that instead of focusing on the impossible or difficult conversations, let's focus on making conversations better in general. Then you have less of a need for difficult conversations. So it's the same concept as conflict transformation. Or if you're following psychology, positive psychology is a good example of that. For years, we studied pathologies. We studied what was wrong with humans. We studied depression. We studied mental health. We studied, mental sickness. Recently, there's been a move with positive psychology to study thriving, to study happiness. What makes people sing? What makes people thrive? And the result of that has been way better research around human performance, us understanding how humans perform. And I'm making a similar argument that instead of focusing on the difficult conversation or the crucial conversation or whatever, how about we focus on making conversations in general so we reduce the need for those difficult conversations? And that's what I'm realizing that is a big missing piece when you look at all the research around conflict, around conversations, around teamwork dynamics, etc. It's not it's focused on the difficult piece because that's what the problem is, and the presenting problem is very rarely where the problem lies. That's what I'd like people to take away from this.
Mic drop. We leave you there. I want to thank you for coming on. Before we close up, maybe if you could give just a little trailer, 30-second trailer as to what people can expect at the upcoming masterclass next week, where you are unveiling your process for building conversations better that we could put in practice across the board, not just looking for high conflict situations. What can people expect?
So what people can expect not to get are silver bullets and like magic solutions that are going to help you have a better conversation every time. What I'm looking to do in that session is to help you change your mindset around how you approach and enter conversations. Because there's a lot of research happening now that is talking about what works, and a lot of it is actually counterintuitive. So I'm stumping an example right now. A good example would be changing people's minds. I told the story of Larry Trapp and Michael Weiser. Sending love notes to somebody who wants to kill you, who is saying Jews suck and sending you death threats is really counterintuitive. But that story is so powerful around how we change people's mind and how we make the world a better place. And what I'm hoping to do in that session is to really give you practical tools and tips that if you take one of them and put them into practice, you can have better conversations, primarily in our personal lives and sometimes in our professional lives. Because I think you cannot make a distinction between better conversations in professional and personal. If I teach you how to have better conversations professionally, you're going to have better conversations personally. So this is about how do you make conversations, because we can accomplish nothing in life without conversation.
That's right.
Key to collaboration in this world is conversations. So my hope is that I can give you a few things that I've learned and read and kind of pulled together to help you have those better conversations wherever you're having them. So that's what the people can expect.
Yeah, and I'm really excited in that masterclass to explore, how I could implement or start practicing some of the stuff that you would be sharing in like negotiations. I think that it would be really helpful as well to not approach negotiations the way sometimes we've been kind of prepared as lawyers to approach negotiations. I'm sure that there's going to be fertile ground for us there.
Big word there for you is empathy.
For sure. Empathy, yeah. So thanks so much for plugging in with us. It was supposed to be half an hour, but
as usual, business as usual.
No, but this conversation was, come on, just so riveting. And we could go on and on, but we have to stop. Thanks to all of you plugging in. Yeah.
So before you close off, can I just ask both of you, what's been most valuable for you today?
Oh my gosh, you're putting us on the spot.
I am, sorry.
I think your stories, and particularly the story about the guy with the Jew, and with the love notes. I like the idea that you shared today about, instead of pushing against that which is different from you, that you plant seeds of doubt. I like that whole idea. And then the story that you shared about that guy and how he used love to drive out hate, like Martin Luther King would say, don't fight hate with hate, or it is not hate that will drive out hate, but it is love that will drive out hate. So yeah, I plant seeds of doubt. I'm going to think about that.
And yeah,
to me, that was actually a big one as well. Going back to the conflict transformation instead of conflict resolution, I do believe that conflicts are inevitable. We're going to be entering them all the time. It might be not so often if we really improve the conversation, but I like the notion of really planting the seed of doubt, because it almost is as if we want, or we intentionally start a conflict, or at least, plant something that might raise up to the conflict.
Yeah. Perpetuate the conflict.
Yeah. So it's almost as if, a mini exercise to prevent the big conflict at the end of the day. I very much love that notion.
Yeah,
I'm going to go back because of the time. But sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to. It's not one approach all the time, guys. And I'll always say that.
So just on the conflict.
There's no formula.
No. Make a distinction between task conflict and personal conflict. So we can fight about a task all day long. Like, how do we implement this thing? How do we make this product? We can fight and argue about that. A personal conflict is very, very different. So in a working context, it's really good to have a task conflict, because it means you're trying to get this idea better. You're trying to make this product better. Where's the problematic is when I'm saying you're stupid. That's problematic, and that's not a good conflict.
Projections,
But if someone is repeatedly doing a particular behavior that's hurtful to you or offensive to you,
then you have to have a conversation. Yeah,
you have to have a conversation. But I guess we could have it by planting seeds of doubt and seeking to understand the other first and all of that.
Well,
Yeah?
like when you say that, I feel this way, and then the person says, "Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't know that that made you feel that way," right? So there are
Yeah,
lots
don't
of
tell
ways.
them now. We will do it in the masterclass. I'm kidding. Thanks, Keita. It's been a lot of fun. Always learn so much every time we have a conversation. Well,
There we go.
I learn from you. Lots
Thank
of
you,
love.
everybody. Thank you.
bye.
All the best.
Yeah.
Talk
So
soon.
you all,
Bye.
the links are below. The links are below this conversation. futurelaw.io/masterclasses. Register now. We still have space, and it's going to be really interactive, where you're going to actually practice some of these things that Keita is going to be taking us through. You want to learn more about Keita's project, go to Better Conversations. I'm going to put the link in now. Go to betterconversationsproject.com. betterconversationsproject.com. Okay? Lots of love, guys. See you. Bye.
Bye.